Hello and welcome to NewsClick. The BJP government seems to be on an ordinance spree, not having been able to get their legislations through. Ordinances have been issued on a variety of subjects ranging from the land acquisition to increasing FDI in insurance, permitting e-rickshaws in Delhi and so on. To discuss this emerging ordinance Raj, we have with us today well-known journalist Paranjay Guha Thakurta. Welcome, Paranjay.
Thank you, Raghu, for having me on this program.
Let me start by asking you, of these ordinances, and there's a spree clearly, which do you think are the key ordinances that the government has put forward? And why do you think the government has been so keen to get the ordinances through rather than wait for legislation?
Let's try and understand what were the circumstances which led the Narendra Modi government to promulgate as many as 8 ordinances since it came to power on the 26th of May 2014. It's interesting that the first act of the government, the first ordinance that was promulgated, was to ensure that Mr. Nripendra Mishra became the principal secretary to the Prime Minister. Now, Mr. Mishra had earlier been the head of the Telecom Regulatory Authority of India, and the act under which the TRAI was formed had specifically mentioned that the former chairman could not hold any government post. And then they argued it that other regulatory bodies like the electricity regulator didn't have such a law. So why should this law only exist for the TRAI chairman? But what we saw more recently in the winter session of Parliament in December 2014, we know clearly that the Bharatiya Janata Party and the NDA, the National Democratic Alliance, does not have a majority in the Rajya Sabha, the upper house of Parliament, whereas it has a majority in the lower house of Parliament. So what we found was that whereas the Lok Sabha worked about 90% of the time, the Rajya Sabha hardly worked. It didn't work 40% or close to 40% of the time. Now, what were these ordinances? There were ordinances to bring in e-rickshaws in the capital. There were ordinances. The most recent ordinance was the one which the promise that Mr. Narendra Modi made at the Pravasi Bharatiya Sammelan, that is, you merge the PIO, the person of Indian origin, and those who are overseas citizens of India, right? And then you had other ordinances, but I think the two most important ordinances are the one to amend the Land Acquisition Act, and the full act is called the Right to Fair Compensation and Transparency in Land Acquisition, Rehabilitation and Resettlement Act. That one, and the one to increase the cap of foreign direct investment in insurance companies from 26% at present to 49%. And I think it was really these two laws which were sought to be amended and which are perceived to be quote unquote industry friendly, which are perceived to be in favor of what the corporate sector, what business people want, what foreign investors want. So the point is, what was the tearing hurry? And in particular, I believe the most contentious ordinance is the one to amend the LARR Act, the Land Acquisition Act. And why is it contentious? Not only because the non-BJP opposition is all united against it, including the Congress. There is a section within the Bharatiya Janata Party and the Sangh Parivar, the broader ideological fraternity or the family of organizations under the RSS, the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, and it is very clear that there is a section now within the Sangh Parivar which is opposed to this ordinance and the change in the law.
We've seen Parliament was not able to function, certainly in the upper house. And many people would say that this is the opposition now paying back the BJP in the same coin, because the BJP also paralyzed Parliament when the UPA government was there. And the BJP is now trying to skirt around this issue. But there's another issue that I thought was interesting, and that was, if you look at the land acquisition bill which was amended by this ordinance, the earlier bill which is in place was actually approved by a Parliament Standing Committee, of which the current Speaker of the Parliament belonging to the BJP was chairperson, Sumitra Mahajan. So it's a really, in a sense, a BJP approved bill which the BJP itself is trying to amend. When the UPA government was in power, the insurance bill to amend FDI going up from 26 to 49 was opposed by the BJP. So why are we seeing this double standard by the BJP today?
You are absolutely right. You know, there is more than an element of hypocrisy. Because when the Bharatiya Janata Party was the principal opposition party, it opposed the same legislation. And so you can say there is opposition for the sake of opposition. The same BJP disrupted the working of Parliament, both houses of Parliament, when it was the opposition party. Now the Congress, which has by and large supported the BJP on a number of economic issues, including specifically this whole issue of the cap on foreign direct investment on insurance companies going up to 49%, is now opposing it. Now, there is an element of hypocrisy on the part of not just the BJP, but also the Congress. Sure. It is opposition for the sake of opposition, even if both these two parties are more or less ideologically aligned on this particular issue. That's one aspect of the problem. On the issue of issuing ordinances, Mr. Modi's government and the track record, one ordinance in 28 days is matched only by that of Indira Gandhi. So, I mean, it's not that other governments, other prime ministers haven't done exactly what the BJP is doing. On the issue of the Land Acquisition Act, I think the situation is a little more serious and a little more complex. And let me again first give you here what Mr. Jaitley has suggested is the reason why the Land Acquisition Act is being sought to be amended through this ordinance, and this is where I would say that the BJP is treading on very, very thin ice, and let me suggest why. What Mr. Jaitley had said, and Mr. Jaitley in his blog had clearly said that the reason why the land acquisition law, that is the Right to Fair Compensation and Transparency in Land Acquisition, Rehabilitation and Resettlement Act of 2013 was being amended, was because this bill envisaged amending 13 other acts by the end of the calendar year, that is by the end of the 31st December 2014, and if they are not brought on par, these would not enable the government to provide compensation and rehabilitation provisions. And these acts apply to national highways, metro railway projects, atomic energy projects, defense establishment, electricity projects, etc., etc., etc. But I think what the government is not saying is also equally important. Not only was this law in its present form a consequence of years of deliberation within Parliament, including by the Parliamentary Committee headed by Mrs. Sumitra Mahajan, who happens to be the Speaker of the Lok Sabha, and that also explains why a section of the BJP is very, very unhappy. I think the most contentious element of this new law is that what Mr. Jaitley is claiming, that the reason why this act needs to be amended, in his blog on the 5th of January, he said, a highly complicated process of acquisition renders it difficult or almost impossible to acquire land. And he says because of this, there are large numbers of projects and huge amounts of money that have been blocked. But let's look at the facts. The facts say, and there is a report of the Controller and Auditor General of India which clearly shows that this is not, this is a misleading statement, that for instance, acquisition of land for special economic zones, if we look at that as a case in point, there were at the end of November, early December 2014, of the 491 approved special economic zones spreading over 51,055 hectares, only 40% have become operational, and that too after 7 years of land acquisition. So even before the Land Acquisition Act was amended, and you had an 1894 Act, the situation was not very different. So you are actually not telling the full story, but what you're instead doing is that you are diluting the law, and you are diluting a law that was enacted by parliament in which your own party was a willing, not as a participant, was cooperated fully.
Let me come back to the ordinances having been issued. And as you pointed out, the idea seems to be to convey a message, as they say, to potential investors. But we saw even during the Pravasi Bharatiya conference in Gujarat, several investors and US government spokesmen, for example, said nobody's going to bring in their money until these ordinances actually get converted into full-fledged legislation. The stalemate in Rajya Sabha may continue. The President has already indicated his unhappiness at one ordinance after another and is likely to be disinclined to renew the ordinances if the Rajya Sabha doesn't meet and does not pass the legislation. What scenario do you see unfolding during the next session of Parliament, the budget session, with regard to these?
I expect this problem, or the Rajya Sabha not functioning, or the Rajya Sabha not allowing the government to pass these amendments to the acts continuing. I mean, the exact figure is what I was not very sure of, and that what is now very clear is that the Rajya Sabha worked for less than 40% of the time in the winter session, whereas the Lok Sabha worked 96% of the time. So yes, in the Lok Sabha, where the Bharatiya Janata Party has a majority, it worked 98% of the scheduled time, I stand corrected, and the Rajya Sabha worked for only 59%. The BJP is not going to get a majority in the Rajya Sabha for at least some more time, at least another year and a half. I mean, most people are saying that sometime by around the middle of 2016 they might get a majority. But till then, you're going to see this kind of obstruction continuing. So, if Mr. Jaitley believes that by promulgating these ordinances, and these are industry friendly and business friendly, he's going to actually attract investments, as you have rightly pointed out, this may not happen. Because at the end of the day, what have you done? This land acquisition ordinance has scrapped what is called a social impact assessment, which includes this prior informed consent for several categories of projects. And these include special economic zones and power plants and all kinds of projects. Investors will wait. If there is no consensus, not only across the political class, I mean, so even if the Bharatiya Janata Party has a majority in the lower house of Parliament, the Lok Sabha, but it doesn't have one in the upper house. So there's going to be this stalemate. But what is equally significant to note, that there is an opposition from within. And I reiterate that point, and I have it from very, very reliable sources, that within the government, say within the Ministry of Rural Development, there was opposition. Now, maybe the Speaker of the Lok Sabha, Mrs. Mahajan, cannot say it in so many words, but it is a fact that she presided over that committee, she headed that committee, which approved a whole lot of rules and a whole lot of laws, which are now being sought to be diluted and changed. So, there is the absence of consensus, not only across the political spectrum, but within the ideological fraternity of the Sangh Parivar, would, in my opinion, probably ensure that we have a repetition of what we had during the winter session of Parliament in the budget session. As for the role of the President, yes, there were some news reports which suggested that he was a little hesitant in promulgating the land acquisition ordinance, but he's gone ahead and done it. We know that when the UPA government was in power, Mr. Pranab Mukherjee, the President of India, had refused to sign the ordinance which sought to protect the convicted members of Parliament and lawmakers. So, the whole issue is really the urgency. Why this urgency? I mean, yes, the government wants to say that yes, we are on the ball, where we are working, but it could backfire on the government, because even if you move in too much of a hurry, but you're unable to sustain that momentum, you're unable to get these laws passed in Parliament, then the purpose for which you promulgated that ordinance would fail.
And if the Rajya Sabha does not, in the next session, endorse the legislation or pass the legislation, and if the government is compelled to reissue the ordinance, then the urgency question will assume even more importance because then it won't be urgency so much as expedience which will be the guiding.
And that would be a loss of face for the government. And that is a real and a distinct possibility. I think it's important that when you look at laws and amending laws and changing laws, that you really have a consensus in place there. Because if you don't do that, and if you want to rush through by telling the world how proactive you are, how quickly you're working, but if you cannot sustain that momentum, then at the end of the day, you might act in haste today, but then you'll end up repenting at leisure day after tomorrow.
Thank you very much, Paranjoy. Very interesting discussion. I'm sure we'll be back to discuss the fate of these ordinances or their companion legislations sometime in the not too distant future. Thank you.